Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce and welcome to my channel. Before I get on with the introduction, I would like to make a couple of public statements. First and foremost, I want to thank everybody who is working right now to support the various different infrastructures that allow us to stay healthy, to remain fed, and to get our electricity and our internet and all our various utilities. Big shout out to you folks. Thank you for going to your jobs, getting out of your house, and doing the things that we need you to do. Secondly, I would like to ask on behalf of people who are in need right now, that those who are out there buying things at these various different shopping centers, try to just get what you need and leave something for other people, because there are people who are in need, and if we don't regulate our various different desires, things might end up being a lot worse than they need to be. So enough about current events. Today's guest is Bo Winegard. Bo Winegard is a social scientist who recently got pushed out of academia by a gaggle, I don't even know the collective noun for a bunch of cowardly online trolls that went after his tenure track position, and the administration that he was, I guess was administering his position, caved to these trolls and decided not to renew his contract. So he's kind of out on the street now, thanks to the woke scolds and the people who are apparently hell-bent on pushing our culture as close as possible to the intellectual dark age that is always right around the corner. Now, several times I've tried to encapsulate exactly what we talk about, but we talk about so much, and the various different dynamics in culture right now, the various different difficult or dangerous questions that should be asked that we really need to think about, and why can't we ask those things? Why can't we talk about those things? It's a very stimulating conversation. Really proud to have him again, pushed into pixels and shoved out in your general direction. Hope you guys are well. Hope you guys are safe. I hope you guys are clean, calm, collected, and here is Bo Winegard.
So we were talking about the most dangerous idea, right?
Yeah, or even question.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of very dangerous questions that I wouldn't ask even to most people. But probably the most dangerous idea that I think I've forwarded, or at least talked about, is that different human cultures are different both because of historical reasons and because of the traits of the people who create them. And so I think it's quite likely, for example, that Northern Europeans create different kinds of cultures from Northeast Asians because they have slightly different traits on average. Now, it's important to know that that's an average. I'm not saying every, European is more individualistic than every Northeast Asian. But in the aggregate, there are certain differences, and those probably lead to the creation of slightly different cultures and societies.
Mm-hmm. And by traits, are you talking about like the big five, like openness, industriousness, et cetera, et cetera? Possibly
those, yeah. I mean, like, the problem with these personality traits, the big five that we're talking about, is they're sort of, they're crude measures. It's hard to get at, like, all of the things that we might be talking about. But yeah, there might be differences there, differences in sort of social sensitivity, differences in propensities toward guilt, toward shame. There's that kind of like guilt shame culture idea.
Yeah.
Differences in intelligence, all kinds of differences. And I guess the sort of traditional dogma is that all of those differences are historical and culturally created, or historically and culturally created. And it's not a unique idea with me. Nicholas Wade made this case in A Troublesome Inheritance, and other people have made it, but I think it's very plausible, and I think it's very interesting. And probably that's the one that I was like the most worried about forwarding. Like I had serious concerns about what it would do to me. It turns out that those were probably legitimate concerns.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that reaction is so strong to that particular idea? Is it because of historical abuse, or because is it deeper than that? Is it butting against some sort of accepted philosophy or presumptions underlying the current culture and academia?
I think both of those things, and those things work together. A lot of these topics were sort of verboten after the Nazi atrocities were fully revealed, right? And people, because obviously they did have grotesque ideologies about race and like superior races and inferior races. And I think there was an understandable backlash in the academy to ideas that sounded anything like that. And so you can see if you're suggesting that, well, yeah, there are different human populations. They do have different traits. You can see how somebody can go from that and to say, oh, are you suggesting that one group's superior to another group or whatever it happens to be? So I think that's a lot of it. But I also do think there's sort of I don't think that there are many political necessary political implications to this stuff. But I do think it probably does undermine some progressive ideals, right? Because I think there's the progressive idea is that it's not that humans are blank slates. I think that's unfair to the progressive, but it is definitely that humans are very environmentally flexible. They respond to an environment in a way that I don't think conservatives have to accept or tend to accept. And so I do think that some of these ideas that different groups have different average traits and therefore will likely have different average outcomes in society, even if there is no racism or bigotry, that is disconcerting to sort of progressive values. And so I think that causes another problem. So I see the historical one as a little bit more legitimate and understandable. I see it violates my political desires as sort of less understandable. I mean, understandable in a moral sense. I mean, it's understandable in a psychological sense. I get why it happens, but I'm not as sympathetic to it.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't it open up, if you can look at culture as producing different outcomes, doesn't that open up like a cultural eugenics, like not trying to sculpt actual human beings, but trying to socially engineer a culture?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because people, I think, find this surprising, or maybe they think I'm even lying, but one of my intellectual heroes is Noam Chomsky. And one thing that Noam Chomsky, who's a famous progressive, one thing that Chomsky argued throughout his career was that blank slateism, behaviorism, which he was arguing against, is actually a totalitarian's best friend, because it does suggest that, hey, we can shape humans to be whatever we want. And absolutely, that would sort of play into a cultural, I don't know what you would call it, a cultural, like, we're going to create the greatest humans and we can shape them. They're almost infinitely malleable. And it's a weird thing because people get very worked up if you suggest that there are these differences that are at least partially genetically caused, because they're like, oh, Nazis this, whatever other nefarious group that. But they don't have the same reaction to environmental theories, even though people such as Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot used environmental theories to promulgate some of the most disastrous policies of the 20th century.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up because it's a critique that I've had Stephen Hicks on my channel. He talks about postmodernism, and he talks about well, there's one narrative, I don't know if specifically from him, but the inability for the left-leaning academics to reckon with what happened when the Iron Curtain was raised and everybody saw exactly what, how indefensible these ideas were. But that guilt doesn't translate into current politics, where the Nazi guilt or stigma, the stigma of Nazis, it's radioactive, whereas the stigma of the Soviet Union is acceptable in some way.
Yeah, no, that is weird. There's actually interesting, I forget the author now. It's, one of the arguments about and maybe this is what you were talking to Hicks about, one of the arguments about the rise of postmodernism was that in some sense it was a reaction to the failure of communism, right? And that, you had the left completely dedicated to communism, or a lot of the left at least, and then it was an unmitigated disaster. And so where do you go after that, right? But you're right, it is weird because they haven't really Yeah, there's like Western guilt about the Nazis or whatever, but for some reason we don't have the same kind. And now, I wonder what would have happened. Well, I guess East Germany was communist, and that was disastrous. Yeah, yeah. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just political expediency, like they don't want to own that environmentalism can be equally pernicious. I'm not sure. It is. It's something that it's an argument I've made with a lot of people who most of my friends are on the left. And when they hear it for the first time, I think a lot of them are just shocked by it because they haven't even considered it.
Which argument specifically? The
argument that, like, look, if you're going to say my ideas can be dangerous, so can yours, and like, let's think about that and think about how these ideas also contributed to many deleterious policies, right?
Yeah, well, it seems like this is just a shot in the dark, but it seems that the end game of fascism is is some sort of superiority or some sort of rigid hierarchy or like the elimination of everything below a certain watermark. Whereas the end goal of communism is the equalization or the tearing down of any sort of superiority, the complete equalization. And that's much more palpable to, ironically, the academic elite.
No, I think that's right. I think it's interesting. I once asked this question on Twitter. I asked, would you rather be a fascist or a communist? And a lot of people kept saying, oh, they're both the same thing. Like, who cares? And it's like, no, they're not. I think what you said is actually a pretty good way of looking at it. It's like, fascism is very dedicated to hierarchy, right? That's an important part about fascism. Yeah. And communism is dedicated to getting rid of hierarchy. And so if you have a group of people, academic progressives, who are very uncomfortable with inequality, right? It's something that causes them consternation. It makes sense that they would gravitate toward an idea that says what we should do is try to make everyone roughly equal, right? I mean, it's ironic, as you know, because these people are intellectual elites who
snobby.
Very snobby, which is, it's one of the things that I think Steven Pinker said this about IQ, and it's something that I've noticed as well. Is like you get these people who deny these differences, deny IQ matters or whatever, but they're obsessed with it in their life. Like if you listen to them talk about other people, it's all that person's stupid, that person's ideas are stupid. There's just a lot of this sort of intellectual grandstanding. But then there are these proclamations of equality, etc., which makes me think that there's more than a little signaling going on, right?
Yeah. I wonder why people think, like they were answering your question, that fascism and communism are the same is because they both are trying to subjugate society to a certain end or a certain vision. Yeah. And it's that subjugation that makes them very similar and is what wreaks the havoc that people are afraid of.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but I think like clearly what I was trying to get at with the question is like, how okay are you with hierarchy? I think is like sort of the main point there with hierarchy and nationalism too, because communism was explicitly anti-nationalistic, at least before sort of Stalin faced the realities of human nature and used especially you can see it during World War II, you kind of have to. But like Lenin and other thinkers were very anti-nationalistic. They thought the revolution would be exported everywhere and be like a communist brotherhood, right? So fascism would be more nationalistic, more hierarchy, communism less nationalistic. But in practice, it's definitely the case that in both of them, you're subjugating. Well, I mean, I guess what you're doing is you're taking away a lot of liberty in the name of something higher, right?
Yeah.
Because one of my fundamental axioms of politics is that liberty and equality are eternal enemies, right? And I think anybody who's selling you a theory where you can have complete freedom and complete equality is selling you snake oil, right? Because you just can't. The more that you open things up and the more freedom that you have, the more you're going to create inequality.
And the author Ian McGilchrist believe he's a professor or a doctor as well. He writes a lot about the left brain, right brain split in a number of his different works. I'm going through, I'm just going to look it up right now because I always forget the names of things, and then I feel like an idiot when I publish. Yeah, The Master and His Emissary, which is about the left brain, right brain splits. But he talks about competitive processing, where these things aren't necessarily enemies. These two processes, whatever they are, let's say liberty and equality, it's not that they're enemies, it's that they're constantly pitted in the tug of war. And if you can get those two things to be in a competitive kind of binary, then they can produce something in between that's stable and progressive at the same time. Like it has elements of tradition and elements of, renovation going back and forth between itself.
That what you just expressed might be too profound for me because I'm not sure that I grasp it completely.
What I'm trying to lay down is how do we put those two things into some sort of pair bond, like the tension, and then wrest some sort of fruitful, stable society between liberty and equality? And how do you do that with these dangerous ideas? How do you do this with these different pressures that want to push things too far in either direction?
Yeah, I mean, so as far as the freedom equality is concerned, what I think is important, and this is something that I've become more and more persuaded of the more sort of, I guess, the older and hopefully the wiser that I get, is that we just have to accept and be honest about trade-offs, right? So like, if you're going to promote libertarianism, that's fine. But be aware that there are serious trade-offs there. Same way with, say, socialism or something. So, I think libertarianism does have some. I'm not particularly fond of it, but I understand it, and there is this sense that you are promoting more freedom, and that's kind of a good thing. On the other hand, it's going to create more inequality. It tends to atomize people and treat them as though what they're doing is maybe not affecting other people, which, as we can see right now, is you can sort of see where that thought breaks down because we're all very interconnected in ways. Whereas sort of socialism or something where you try to make people more equal, you are taking away people's freedom. I think progressives, though, I've talked to people about this too. It's like, the sort of slogan, taxation is theft.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it's kind of a silly slogan, and whatever, but there is some truth to it, right? It is the case that when you redistribute resources, you are taking money from people who worked to earn it. And I think we should just be honest about that instead of pretending that there's no trade-off there. There absolutely is a trade-off, right? Like people work hard and 30% of their income, well, I mean, at the margins, whatever, but, X amount of their income goes to the government and they redistribute it. That's a trade-off, and I'm okay with that. I would accept it, and I would just try to be honest about it and say, yeah, there's a trade-off there. I prefer a little bit more equality at the expense of a little bit of freedom, and that's okay to me. And let's have a debate about where we should put that line.
Yeah, I think that makes sense of like a refrain that you bring up on Twitter that I've seen you do several times about nationalism. And I've been thinking about the progressive movement in the United States right now and how there's this undercurrent of anti-Americanism in it. Yeah. Like it pops up, and it's pretty ugly when it pops up, but there's some pretty obvious examples of it. And it seems to be counterproductive to have that kind of anti-nationalist attitude inside of a movement that's trying to inspire people to work together on a civic level, to donate and to support everyone. It seems like that narrative itself, it counteracts like trying to inspire people to work for the greater good.
I could not agree with you more. I think that's absolutely correct. It's a very. I had a few debates with people about this, and I hope that I got somewhere with them because I said, like, look, if you're trying to get people to sacrifice some level of freedom, but then you're also telling them you shouldn't love like this bigger unit that you're sacrificing for, right? It's like a really bizarre thing, because the way that you would get people, human nature being what it is, it's tribalistic, right? We know this. Just, copious amount of literature on this. You can get people to make sacrifices, but the way that you do that is you appeal to a greater unit.
Yeah.
America, the greatest country in the world, or whatever you want to call it. It's totally astonishing to me when people want to break down that sense of a larger tribal unit for smaller tribal units, such as racial groups or sexual, like the identity politics. You're breaking apart that greater unit, and you can kind of see this. So it's interesting to look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders is an old school class warrior. And the old school class warriors thought the main cleavage in a society is class-based. And so they thought all of these appeals to race and sexuality, they were sort of distractions, and they were ways of fragmenting the working class. So you can kind of see Sanders doesn't like that. But he's had to become woke, because you have to be woke in today's Democratic Party. So now he sort of like has to appeal to that. And that tension strikes me as like, that's at the heart of like the progressive movement, the tension between having this larger tribal unit and having one that breaks apart to these small interest groups that compete against each other. And incidentally, this is probably something that happened to the union movement, because unions in the 60s and the 70s, they weren't exactly full of woke people, right? So
they're working class, like true working class.
Exactly. And just not as a side point, but as an interesting point, now Trump's leadership during this crisis has been so appalling to me that I may not be able to vote for him.
Okay.
But I consider myself a working class person who's willing to make the trade-off for more economic inequality. And I've sort of always had that view. And what's changed is where I think, which party I think can do that now. And I've actually become convinced that in maybe 8-10 years, the Republican Party will be the better party for that, because they're more sympathetic with these working class people, precisely because they're not only are they not woke, a lot of Republicans now sort of detest wokeism. That's the attitude of the working class, right? I grew up in the Midwest. These people, the jokes that they tell that I grew up with would get you cast out of polite society now by these sort of progressive elites. So there's this very interesting dynamic that's happening where the sort of old union people, they kind of broke apart because there are lots of causes, obviously, and I'm not an expert on the decline of unions, but I do know part of it is the left became more interested in sexuality and racial identity and those kinds of things than the underlying class stuff.
Yeah.
And the unions are more like, we don't care if there are gay people in union or not. Like, that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in protecting our workers. And they're middle-brow people. They're not obsessed with, did you use the exact right epithet for this group or that group, right? Yeah. That's not what they care about. So, yeah, all of that stuff is really interesting. And it seems as though there's a realigning now, because the more educated elites, right, the coastal elites, they're in the Democratic Party now. So the Democratic Party is basically like rich urban elites and minority groups, and the working class more and more is joining the Republican Party, especially the white working class, obviously. And yeah, I don't know how you get people to sacrifice for the greater good if you tell them that it's not only is it sort of like, not only should you not do it, but it's actually like boorish and immoral to support your country. Like, I remember Jeremy Scahill is a good example of this, when people were celebrating when Osama bin Laden was killed. And Scahill was like talking about how it was so embarrassing for him as an American. It's just like this atavistic, primitive celebration of this. And it's like, Yeah, look, I can, like, okay, I can kind of see it, but like, look, this guy was the mastermind of a plot that killed 3,000 some Americans. Like, what do you expect? Of course, people are going to rally around the flag, and they probably should.
Yeah. There's this metaphor that I play with every now and then that you brought to my mind again of the progressive lenses. I wear progressive lenses, so they're like a trifocal, but there's this medium part where it just
Okay.
blends in, and
Uh-huh.
it's a stupid play on words, but like there's the close up vision and then the long vision and then this mid range vision, and it seems like the progressive has a hard time with the middle. It has a hard time. It can think universally about humanity, like we're all one human. There should be no
Yeah.
borders. But then,
Right.
because it can't sustain that, it eventually collapses down on the closest, most rudimentary, sex, sexuality,
Right.
race. It collapses. There's no that middle ground. There's a problem with the middle ground, and the nation resides in the middle between the humanity as a species and
Yes.
humanity as these little tiny tribes, and it just like it squeezes that out for some reason. And
I
I
actually
have a hard
like
time
that.
focusing on that for some reason.
I don't think that's a clumsy play on word at all. I like that. I do. No, I think because I almost think the focusing on the more like parochial and myopic groups, those groups is the inevitable result of getting rid of that middle ground. If
Yeah.
you're not looking at the middle, because humans are tribal, they're going to fill that vacuum with something. And it turns out that something today is like, trans issue, race, I mean, it gets pretty absurd when you go into the victimology and you look at like, well, what about women of color in wheelchairs or,
Yeah.
whatever, like very specific group is now making a plea that no, we're like a greater victim group. You have to identify with us or whatever it is. Yeah. And you wipe out the middle. That's kind of what you get. If you have the middle, I think, look, we're still going to notice these distinctions, but we can at least get people not to obsess about them. And I think the thing that would be nice for people to recognize, especially here, I think progressives more, it's really hard to have a multi-ethnic society. And I think like David Frum makes this point a lot. I've heard him make it, which is ethnic conflict is the rule, not the exception, right? Like if you look through history, ethnic groups, when they live together, tend to have conflict with each other. And so like the experiment that the United States is embarked on is a very bizarre and potentially dangerous experiment. And so like we have to be careful about encouraging and inflaming these tensions. And I think the best way to sort of subdue them is by appealing to the greater good. And I mean, there's tons of research on this, right? Like if you look at where do you get the most racial harmony in, say, a high school, it's always the sports teams. Why? Because they have a greater cause.
Yeah.
They're trying to win games. They don't care if you're they don't care the color of the point guard. They want a good point guard. That's what they care about. I want to somehow get that kind of feeling at the level of a higher community. I'm rereading Camus' The Plague.
Yeah,
So,
is that helping you, like giving you some existential
yeah.
grounding?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've got into Camus, so I'm like, okay, I'm reverting to my like adolescent existentialism.
Yeah.
Like what's the meaning of life? What am I even doing here? Because you sort of get comfortable with the way things are, and I think it's good that we usually forget about it, right? We're like, I have stuff to do. I'm teaching my students. I'm running in the morning. I'm doing whatever it is, something like this where everything kind of comes to a pause. You start to contemplate, hey, if I die in a month from now, what's the point of it all? Unfortunately, the answer is there isn't one.
So you max out on like there is no why kind of.
Yeah.
Right.
I wish I didn't. Like, I have great respect for, say, religion, for example, which does provide like a pretty reasonable why. But I'm not a believer, so ultimately I max out at, you make your own purpose while you're alive, and that's that.
Okay. Well, that goes back to what we were talking about before the technology failed us, about nationalism, about having a stable narrative
Yeah.
structure between the universal and the, I guess, identitarian group. And
Yes.
doesn't religion fill in that for most people? And how would you replace that with a nationalism without like a god, the ideal of a transcendent meaning structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually kind of worry about replacing religion with nationalism, because you can kind of see where you tried to do that with socialism, or well, communism and fascism sort of both tried to replace religion that way. And I don't know if this is true, but I do think that, as I wrote in that Twitter thread that you were discussing, that religious belief is very natural, and I fear that if you attempt to eradicate it, you just leave a vacuum for probably more pernicious religious type phenomena to fill. Mm-hmm. So I and a number of other people have made the argument that social justice warriorism, if you will, is a kind of religion, and I think it's a worse religion. So I actually fear, I want nationalism to work with religion in some sense, or religion to be like what Yuval Levin and others call like an intermediary institution, right? Like some sort of institution below the national level, because I think those are important as well. But I was never very sympathetic to the new atheist. I don't know. How old are you now? 30?
I'm 40 something.
Okay, so you went through the new atheist, like when they were quite popular.
I'm aware that it was happening, but I was involved in other things.
Okay, yeah. So, it was a big, because I was an atheist at the time, of course, as I still am. But I argued against it because I thought it was intellectually presumptuous, I suppose. Kind of misguided to believe that you could just eradicate this thing that had been around for thousands upon thousands of years, and so I was never really sympathetic to the militant atheism, but I'm even more skeptical of it now, and much more sympathetic actually to certain variants of Christianity, especially. It's the religion I know the best. I mean, there's no particularly chauvinistic reason for that. Although I would say that I think what's important about Christianity is that it's been disciplined by its need to reconcile itself to a post-Enlightenment society. And I think that sort of dialectic between the supernatural and superstitious and the Enlightenment and the way that they had to interact, and that religion had to sort of, Christianity had to change or sort of adjust to.
Christianity had to adjust or reconcile itself with another worldview that didn't have a God in it or didn't have room for faith.
Yeah, or yes, or at least, to a very pro-science, secular worldview. It had to somehow figure out how to adjust in that kind of a world in a way that my understanding is, at least, that, say, Islam hasn't had to exactly, right? Now, I'm not an expert on the history of Islam, and I don't want to make sweeping statements, but from people I've talked to, and I read books on it, it does seem as though that there's something there, and that maybe that's why Christianity is more able, in my opinion, to promote values that are important to Western liberal societies than some other religions are. And therefore, I'm sympathetic to Christianity because of that, and because I do think, there's Christopher Hitchens, for example, is basically God poisons everything. But I think it's just manifestly the case that a lot of religious believers are motivated to do very good things by their religion. And I don't know that you can replace that. And if you do replace it with something more novel, so like wokeism, for example.
Which hasn't really been tested.
Exactly, exactly. And this is where I guess you could call it my Burkeanism comes out. Like I trust things that have had to adjust and evolve more than I do novel things.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that my question or my skepticism of a non-religious belief system is that how many people can it support before it starts to manifest religious behaviors? Like how many people could be atheists in a society before that atheist tribe starts to manifest certain behaviors that we've seen that are negatively looked upon in religion, like policing, guilt tripping. Like there's a beautiful article that was printed on Slate Star Codex about how new atheism devolved into social justiceism, and I think it's because the social dynamics require some sort of glue, some sort of moral fabric. And without some sort of transcendent narrative, with this atheism is purporting to have a non-narrative or completely a radically open-ended narrative where you can never believe anything. You always have to be open to proof or question.
Yeah, you know what? That's actually I hadn't thought of it exactly the way you put it, but you're right. It's almost as if what you could. So I think you can get individuals who are atheists, who are skeptical, who actually evince all of those characteristics. But you're right. It's almost as if it's like a kind of like force where the more people you get into that group, the more likely it just is to become quasi-religious. And so, yeah, you're right. I don't think you could sustain a real movement or of any kind of thing that was totally devoid of some kind of transcendental narrative. And then the question is, right, what's the best transcendental narrative to have, right? So it's just a question of like, which one should we have, which is more harmful, et cetera. And it seems to me that some versions of the Christian transcendental narrative I find immensely appealing. The emphasis on humility, charity, meekness, I mean, taking care of other people, all of these things that are like maybe unnatural. And so I don't want to say, I mean, because we have both pro-social and anti-social tendencies.
Yeah.
So basically the point is, I think that some version of Christianity seems to promote the pro-social tendencies and has been tested much more than new religious replacements such as wokeism or even, like new ageism. Oh, there's just this energy everywhere, or whatever, these things that I just don't see how they can actually work for coordinating large groups of people.
Does that hold true, you think, with existentialism? Like going back to like you recognizing or reverting into the existential open-ended, what does it mean? There's no reason, but I still have to wonder it because that's where meaning's made.
Right.
Can you as a person maintain that for any extended period of time? And how many people can maintain that without it,
Yeah, it's a good question because you're right. Like existentialism basically becomes its own narrative, except for the narrative's kind of like a meta narrative. So it's like our narrative is there isn't a narrative, but you have to keep asking for a narrative. And that's like what it is to be human. I don't think existentialism would provide sustenance for enough people to be particularly popular. It works for me because I can't believe, even though I kind of would like to. So as somebody who would like to sort of had some transcendent meaning, I can sympathize with the sort of disappointment of people who you can tell clearly have, like Albert Camus, I think, for example, clearly had like religious longings. You can kind of tell. And in fact, of the French existentialists, I think he was more sympathetic to religion than, say, Sartre or de Beauvoir. And that's why I find him a more interesting thinker. But I think it's almost like just comes down to personality at that point. Okay. It's like, okay, what kind of personality do you have? I have like kind of an existentialist personality because I have religious longings that I can't satisfy with religion. So I satisfy it via art, film, novels, poetry.
Can I ask why you disallow yourself? Is it a predisposition of like not trusting the certainty involved in that?
Of religion?
Yeah, you said
I can't intellectually accept it.
okay.
Yeah, so like I actually grew up Christian. I was Christian until I can't put an age exactly on it, but I was never like a conservative Christian or anything. I was more of a very, very liberal type Christian. Really just some of the intellectual arguments were too much for me to get around. The problem of evil I thought was impossible to get around, and I didn't find the causal arguments or arguments from design particularly persuasive. So yeah, it's more of an intellectual thing for me.
Okay, yeah, because somebody who responded to you, I've interviewed Esther.
Yeah, O'Reilly or whatever.
O'Reilly, yeah, which is a pseudonym, but and I've had her on, and we talk about that, and she reverts into rational arguments about religion, and she loses me because I'm like, religion, the intellectual sphere is encased by religion. The intellectual sphere can't encase religion. There's a part of the human experience that religion is speaking to that doesn't match up and shouldn't match up, shouldn't be solved by an intellectual process. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like like the hand is trying to grasp what the body is, and like the hand is a part of the body. It can't.
Okay, so but to push back on that, I mean, if I do think the new atheists were correct insofar as they argued that some religious claims are empirical propositions. So like the claim, for example, that God created the universe and God is all powerful, all loving, all knowing, etc. Those are empirical claims. And it seems as though we could have intellectual arguments about those claims, couldn't we? So like if you say to me, God is all loving and all powerful, it does seem fair to me to say back to you, if that's the case, then why is there so much suffering in the world? And if you just said, well, you can't grasp that intellectually, as somebody who values reason but does recognize the limits of it, but in this case of an empirical claim, I would say I can't believe that then. Maybe there's some weird thing going on that I can't comprehend, but once you put properties on it, then we can argue about it, right? That's the difference is like, once you say all loving and all powerful, if those terms are to mean something, then we can argue about what they mean and what would the implications be, right? Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, so certain claims within the religion that you grew up in they don't add up once you start going down the path.
I don't think it's possible to reconcile all powerful, all loving with the world that we inhabit.
Okay. and yet there's still a part of you that longs for something that leaps out of that argumentation, and that gap is replaced or filled with what you said is art, the non-rational, perhaps music, the relational.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Things that aren't. I think science is like one part of the world, and in fact, I've written things in defense of scientism. But what's weird is I get a lot of pushback and criticism on that. But I don't think science is the only way to sort of the only mode of operating in the world. In fact, quite the contrary. I think it's a very circumscribed way of doing it, and that I get more. Despite the fact that I'm a scientist, it's my job, or was at least, I get more out of art and film and music than I do out of science. But if it comes to understanding the world intellectually, I think science is the only way to go. Right? The insights that you get, say, from watching The Godfather, you could intellectualize some of those insights, but mostly it's an immersive experience that you can't really. It doesn't even make sense to translate that into you know what I mean? Like we could talk about Beethoven's Fifth intellectually, and if we had somebody here who had never listened to it, they would have no clue what we were talking about, right? Yeah. They'd be like, that sounds, who cares, right? And then we'd play it for them, and they'd be like, oh yeah, wow.
Okay, yeah. I just, my ultimate argument, or I guess my belief in belief, is that we do need some sort of story in order to capture the meaning of our experience, to give a beginning, a middle, and an end to our rationalization about ourselves as entities in this chaotic experience, and that insofar as the human experience is rational to a certain degree, is intellectual, is verbal, but also sensual, also incredibly emotional, filled with action and reaction. The container for any philosophy is going to be a story. A philosophy can live inside of a story, but it's very rare that a story can completely be contained by a philosophy, right? So intellectualism is a domain of a broader experience, and what fills that gap for our brains, for our minds, it would be narrative, which is a pre-rational way of verbalizing the world.
So I wonder if it's even more primitive than narrative, though. So I'm getting to like, are you familiar with the French philosopher Henri Bergson?
No,
or some of these people like. Okay, so like narrative's very important to me, and I've always been attracted to myth, and Joseph Campbell, and Jordan Peterson's got onto this, and Star Wars, and that kind of stuff really appealed to me. But I think even below that, there's even like a more primitive, just emotional sense of wonder and bafflement at reality that the second you attempt to intellectualize it, it disappears, right? It's almost like it's like the dust in a shaft of light where you turn the light on and it's gone. And you can't analyze it further. It's just there, It's like this primitive sense of who knows what it is, right? It's just this. I'm an existing being that's, and maybe it's even pre-conscious. It's just this astonishment at being, and I'm trying to describe it, and of course I'm blundering it because you can't describe it.
I wonder if, and this is kind of my own personal stuff, but working like with rationality, I admit constantly, and I constantly am aware of things that operate below or beyond the rational, but I firmly believe that the rational is the best method of making decisions and of working with other people and of communicating and testing suppositions and then proceeding in a way that creates a desired, more or less desired result. But in my own journey, my own process of development and figuring out how do I recognize that how do I live in the awareness of being without being awash in that new energy, like just that incommunicable stuff, but still have an awareness, and that comes out in my behavior or in other people's behavior, like with atheism, with the new atheism. What really turned me off was an aesthetic property of the arrogance of a lot of what goes on in atheist communities, like this incredible arrogance. And I find just as much arrogance in religious communities, because people think that I have the answer, I know the way, the truth, the life, and I know how I'm saved. But there's a way of threading that needle of being connected to something much greater as a proposition, perhaps, or just this open-ended, kind of the shaft of light is there, even if I don't see it, but it's still illuminating everything.
Yeah, so I almost feel as though we're going to start talking in like gobbledygook or bad poetry, because
you're right.
Yeah, but I'll just comment on the I find the religious arrogance more tolerable than the new atheist arrogance, because the new atheist arrogance seems more hypocritical to me. Right, because it's sort of the premise of new atheism is kind of like we're ultra rational. I mean, in fact, Daniel Dennett used the term brights at some point, which is spectacularly dim term to use, right? And it just seems as though that's where there's like a danger, a hypocritical danger of actually being dogmatic. While you're promoting this open-minded, rational view of the world. And so, like, I almost have more respect for a completely dogmatic Puritan, because they're claiming they know the one way. They're not even proclaiming we're open-minded rationalists or something.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think both. The human mind clearly has a tendency toward dogma and a sort of tight-fisted ideology that's hard to avoid, and you can go in that direction in many ways, right? Whether it's ultra scientism, which is not the scientism that I defend, but it's like this view that we can understand everything and science is the only way to do anything, and religion, and I don't know how you avoid it either. I guess like humility. This is my brand of conservatism. It's like a kind of humble. So you were saying, for example, about reason or rationality or whatever. I'm not even sure that rationality is the best way to make all decisions, right? It's probably actually a bad way of making many decisions. I've often said this to people. I've said, like, the reason that we don't use reason all the time is because it's too fallible. We're wrong so often. And like, if you were wrong that often, just navigating your everyday life, you would be dead pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of these things, we have intuitions, things that are hardwired or at least like semi-hardwired, and we do things without thinking about it. We move our hand from the hot stove. You don't have to, reason about why you do that. And so I actually think one of the things that conservatism and really reading the literature has taught me is how important it is to recognize that aspect of human decision making, and then how that plays out in institutions as well, right? So institutions, we create institutions. We often don't know what they're going to do, right? We have we're like, okay, we have this problem. We want to try to solve it. So you make an institution, and of course it has 22 different consequences, only 3 of which are what you expected. Yeah. And then what happens is we slowly over time, we adjust those. And then the sort of rationalist comes along and is like, well, this is stupid. Like, why do we have this? Let's just tear it down and start over. And they're ignoring the 100 years of wisdom that are built into that, right? Yeah. Well, so I think, sorry, go ahead. Well, here, let me give one example if I can, and then we can. So like, I think of it like this, and I don't think I'm the first person to give this example, although when I did, I hadn't heard it elsewhere. I thought, like, I was in a debate and I said, okay, so like the conservative is the person that sees the speed limit as 35 and thinks I should go 35. The liberal sees the speed limit as 35 and thinks this is stupid. Why would there be a 35 speed limit here? I'm going to go 55. Right, because the conservative thinks there's probably something that I don't know about this particular law or whatever, and I'm going to follow it. And the liberals like, I need, I don't see the reason for it, therefore I'm let's change it.
I'm going to test it anew.
Yeah, exactly. And of course there are costs and benefits to both ways of viewing the world, but I do think I have gained a profound respect for this sort of idea of the wisdom built in institutions via cultural evolution, just in the past 5 years, really.
Why the last 5 years? Just because of the change in the culture over the last 5 years?
No, actually, like a lot of it is, believe it or not, I was like a massive progressive for most of my life.
I can tell.
Okay. And,
no offense.
Yeah, no, none taken. But to be clear, I was never like a woke identity progressive. I was always more of the economic, Chomskyite progressive, if you will. I actually just sort of gradually listening to Russ Roberts and reading Steven Pinker's The Better Angels, in fact, are 2 things that really compelled me to reconsider my worldview. And then I started reading the original conservative thinkers, Edmund Burke, even some of the reactionaries such as de Maistre, I don't know how you pronounce that, Joseph de Maistre, French reactionary thinker, John Adams, Madison, maybe you would put in the tradition, Russell Kirk, etc. And through reading them, and also people like Joseph Henrich, who write about culture evolution, and actually the book, The Secret of Our Success, which is just an absolutely terrific book, really emphasizes how important this knowledge that's built into these institutions that no individual understands, right? Like, you couldn't recreate this, and you don't have this knowledge. It's somehow everybody's knowledge is put into the institution. And if you ask me to defend the institution, I probably can't, because I don't know why it's there exactly, right? It's like asking me, why is the price of a Tootsie Roll what it is? I have no idea. But that price sends a signal about, how much demand there is for it, how much it costs to produce it, et cetera. That's like a collective wisdom thing. Like Hayek talks about this, right? This sort of collective signal that's built into this that any one individual is completely ignorant of.
This is a really big question, so I don't expect you to have an answer, but is the Western civilization unique in the fact that we have created a progressivism within our traditional structures? Like,
Ooh.
and are we able to afford that? Is that some sort of dynamism that has arisen over time in and of itself as an institution that tears down the institution?
Yeah, I'll bet. No, I'll bet that there. I mean, I don't want to suggest that it doesn't belong in any, or it's completely unique to Western civilization. But I bet you're right that there is something about the West does seem to have like a sort of self-critical, attitude almost built into the institutions, a skepticism about the institution built into the institution. That is interesting, and you're right, so there's an interesting dialectic there, right, between the sort of, conservative, the institution has this collective wisdom, and you don't know why we have the institution there, so, be careful about criticizing it, coupled with this very critical Thomas Jefferson. I think of that as the sort of Jefferson-Adams dialectic, right, the Jeffersonian. I mean, at one point in a letter, he was, so I don't know how serious he was about this, but he was speculating that, maybe we should remake the Constitution every 25 years because it's intolerable that one generation should be chained to the rules of the previous generation, right? It's talk about radical. That's like burn it all down every 25 years. But that dynamism between somebody like an Adams, who's more traditional, although, I mean, obviously he was a vital part of the American Revolution, which was a revolution. But yeah, that dialectic's really interesting. And I have sympathy for both sides in it. I think I tend to emphasize my conservative leanings simply because everybody I'm around is liberal. Yeah. And so I feel as though it's more important for me to defend conservatism to them in an intellectually respectable way. And I'm more critical of liberalism because that's the sea I swim in, right? Yeah. That's what I'm around. Sorry, go ahead.
I think a portion of your critics, the critics that I read, at least on Twitter, don't understand that or don't put it in perspective of you're representing underrepresented ideas. And so they attack you as being conservative or they go overboard. They paint you as some sort of, apologist for, the alt-right, if you turn it all the way up there. But they don't understand that you're trying to balance a conversation. You're not necessarily representing or embodying all these conservative ideas. You're trying to bring them into constellation and keep the dialogue going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, often I get well, why don't you don't criticize conservatives, or people complain about that to me. I'm like, look, we all have a limited amount of time, of course, so we can only do so much. But also, everybody I'm around criticizes conservatives. I was in academia until not too long ago. So everything I was around was critical of conservatives. If I grew up in an entirely conservative community and lived in one now, I would criticize conservatism more. And if academia changes or mainstream intellectual culture, let's say, if that changes, then I would criticize conservatism more.
Mm-hmm. There's back to the progressivism inside of Western culture. To me, I went to Lucifer, like the Miltonian Lucifer. It's the structure being God, like the superstructure that you could never understand because it's too complex, has given a rise to something that rebels against it and seeks to destroy it. And somehow that initiates a process of a renewal of the very principle that's being challenged, or some sort of evolution of the entire structure. It's a weird thing to toy around with.
I love the reference to Milton's Satan. So it's interesting to think about this because I've talked to people about this, and are you from literary studies?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay, so you know how like the romantics were like, well, Satan's the hero of the poem, right? Like William Blake was, like he was of Satan's party, though he didn't know it because he's a poet, or whatever the line was from him. Okay, so like, but to Milton, Satan was not the hero, right? To Milton, God's the hero in that order, and Satan is this person who's rebelling. And you can see this. It's yeah, you're right. It's like it's this sort of like principle that sort of becomes a part of Western civilization through Protestantism, probably in the Romantic movement, of saying the hero of that is Satan, is the person who says, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, right? Yeah. And I've actually thought like your attitude towards Satan in that poem tells me a lot about like the type of person you are. So if you read Paradise Lost and you're like, Satan rules, you can kind of see like, okay, and you can understand it, right? Because he's an interesting character. Yeah. How many 20-year-olds would read Paradise Lost and be like, God's awesome?
There's a certain portion of them.
Maybe, but it's like weird because it's this inscrutable God who like is like, you have to obey me, but there's no real reason for it. And Satan's kind of this guy who's like, why? Why do I have to obey you? Yeah, and that's sort of more relatable. I remember when I was 20 and I read it and I was like, I was scribbling furiously in the side, like, Satan's awesome, yeah,
So then the next question or the problem is that what happens when the Luciferian rebellion overtakes an institution or becomes the god of the institution? What happens when academia becomes all about rebelling against the status quo? The status quo itself becomes some sort of anti-status quo, status quo.
I mean, it's a weird thing, though, because it's like, I think what ends up happening is you act as though you haven't won the victory yet. You know what I mean? So, like, you hear these people in the mainstream media and academia, they act as though they're beleaguered on all sides, and that it's like, dude, you won the culture war like 5 years ago, man. Like gay marriage. And so you find these smaller and smaller issues to obsess about, like trans people in sports, as if this is like an intolerable affront to human dignity or something. And you act as though there's still like the next culture war to win and win and win because, it's sort of, I mean, it's the sort of proverbial shark that has to, it's not actually true, but in the saying, it has to keep swimming. So it's like, yeah, if you have this ideology, what do you do? I mean, because conservatism can be an ideology of stasis. Let's keep things the way they are. Yeah. And let's do that. That can kind of work. But progressivism really can't be, right? It has to be like, there's a new enemy. We're fighting this next battle. We're making things better. So that is interesting because in my opinion, and see what you think about this, like, seems to me in academia and the mainstream media, progressivism has triumphed spectacularly. I mean, that seems that way to me, at least.
Mm-hmm. Well, but there's nothing resisting against it, or insofar as it is being resisted against, it seems like progressivism is unable to adequately tone down its rhetoric to the needs of the situation. Like what happened at Evergreen State College, you're aware of my work on that.
Yes, absolutely.
What happened is that they tried to take the moral importance of the 60s civil rights movement and import the same amount of rhetoric and urgency to the 2017s, right?
Right.
But the scale was totally off. So that when the kids started to act out this, this great American morality play, they had to fabricate all of the injustice in order to justify what they'd been taught was something that they needed to do right now. And I feel that progressivism, it's not adequately attuning itself to the actual very fine granular needs of the current moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think you see this with all, you can kind of see this with like sort of the way we measure racism in social psychology, for example. Like used to be you could just ask people, do you want to live next to somebody who's a different race from you? And they would say, no, I don't. Yeah. And then over time, it got to the point where pretty much everybody's like, I don't care. And so you had to create these more subtle instruments like symbolic racism. But then if you look at the symbolic racism scale, you're actually picking up like things that aren't racist in any clear sense of the word, right? Like like these will ask racial resentment scale, ask a question like this. African Americans should just pull themselves up by the bootstraps the way like Italians and Irish people did or something. It's like, well, that's an empirical question. It doesn't strike me that it's racist to suggest that maybe some of the problems in their community are self-caused and that they should work harder. I mean, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but it's not racist to suggest that it is true, right? So yeah, you have to act as though there are all these massive outrages that if you don't see these outrages, you're must be blinkered by your own bigotry. And I don't see the world that way. I mean, I see there are problems in our society. And, like to me, the biggest problem is like the way that society is becoming riven by cognitive ability and the great cognitive sort. But that's a different question I think there are individuals who are racist, and I think there are individuals who are probably sexist, but I don't think society is either racist or sexist as a whole. In fact, I would argue that it's the opposite. Mainstream society works so hard to be anti-racist and to be anti-sexist that in fact it's basically explicitly hostile toward white men. Now, I'm not saying white men are getting the shaft. I don't think that's true, but the explicit rhetoric of society is basically hostile to white men.
You brought up the cognitive distribution. What'd you say, the cognitive rift? Yeah, like this terrible science fiction vision of what's happening to us.
Yes. Yeah, it really is, right? It is this idea that like society is becoming more and more this is idea that especially like Charles Murray has talked about in the book Coming Apart, that the idea that society is becoming better and better at sorting people by cognitive ability. And as it does that, you get this gap between, say, people of 120 IQ and above and people, say, 90 and below, and they inhabit almost completely different worlds. And as freedom increases, I think this is an interesting thing because we've been talking a lot about these narratives that people need. And like people often complain and argue that when I say this is condescending or paternalistic or something, but I don't think it is. And what it is this. People who have a 130 IQ, I think, can inhabit a different kind of intellectual world than somebody who has an IQ of, say, 95. And I think the person with 130 IQ might be able to live in a world without a strong like narrative that guides his or her life in a way that somebody with a lower IQ might need more guidance. And that's not meant to be condescending. It's just an accurate description of the world. In fact, I think the dangerous thing is denying this and pretending that it's not true. I think that does no service to somebody who struggles in life because they don't have the guidance that they need. And so I'll give you a concrete example. Polyamory. I see, and I really like Jeffrey Miller, and he and I disagree about this to some degree at least. I think polyamory is probably a kind of lifestyle that some super intelligent people might be able to achieve without causing relationship disaster. I believe that they might be able to do that. I am skeptical that it's something that could scale at all to society. And I'm worried that it's something that people would find appealing because what they see is, oh, that means I get to have sex with like 5 women, and I'm concerned that they would do that and it would actually be disastrous in a way that maybe if you're a 140 IQ and you've really thought about it carefully and you're like, okay, we'll do it this way, we'll try to turn off jealousy a bit, we'll try to be responsible, maybe they can pull that off. And so that's like one example. But I also think religion might be the same way. I think it's probably the case, and there's some literature on this, by the way, including an article I'm like 3rd or 4th author on that Corey Clark is 1st author on, about the way that religion interacts with IQ in such a way that it seems as though if you're higher in IQ and self-control, you might not need religion as much. It might not serve the self-control enhancing functions that it does for people who are lower in self-control and maybe lower in cognitive ability. And again, I don't mean that in a condescending way. It's just like a description of the world.
Mm-hmm. But what happens when reality falls out of the control of the super smart person? What happens when Corona comes through and imminent existential threat starts rubbing up against the 140 guy?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're kind of seeing like this. I don't like what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean.
Well, by which I mean is that there are situations in everybody's life that are beyond control. There's
yes.
there's processes within you that escape beyond your control. And I would say that a narrative structure or some sort of practice allows you to have the humility to say that I'm witnessing something that's out of control without myself becoming out of control.
Yeah, you might be right. You might be right, and that might be that sort of rootlessness that maybe a lot of us experience. A lot of the hyper-educated people have is like, maybe it's you come face to face with a real threat or something, and it's truly disconcerting. I mean, I think this kind of rootlessness, by the way, is something you can only get in a very peaceful and affluent society.
You have to
so
afford
you're right.
it.
Yeah, so I like actually, I'm enjoying watching libertarians kind of melt down during this crisis, because you can see it's like libertarianism is this kind of a philosophy that develops in a peaceful, affluent world. All of a sudden a crisis comes, and it turns out, a few people do, but almost nobody wants to be libertarian anymore. They're like, yeah, like we need to crack down, we need this, we need that, central government, take care of this, take care of that. And libertarians, some of them, are trying to still defend freedom and like, fuck you, you're not going to tell me I have to stay in my house or whatever. And right, you can see the sort of illusion that is breaking is the illusion that you are an atom that doesn't affect other people. Right, because you can see with the disease, it's amazing how interdependent everybody is.
Yeah, exactly.
But by the way, it's interesting because I think this holds for morality too. So there's the don't tell me what I do. What I do in my bedroom's my business or whatever. Mm-hmm. But it's not your business, because what you do in your bedroom affects everybody else. Because if you decide you're going to have sex with 72 women, they might have children. You might encourage other people to do it if they find out about it. I mean, there's just this notion, this mythical idea that we're atoms that don't have effects on other people. Mm-hmm. It's truly belied by what's happening now, like very palpably so.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were talking about the cognitive distribution, or the 140 group, or the 120 and above, and then the 90 group, right? And I got this picture of like the stereotypical progressive claim of injustice, like where you have LA, where you have like these really posh estates surrounded by the homeless encampments, and I'm wondering if that doesn't happen in morality, if that doesn't happen in intelligence. And what I was thinking about Bernie Sanders, his platform of the billionaires are the enemy, or the millionaires and the billionaires are the enemy. And like he has this, he stratifies the country into the haves and the have-nots. And because it's so extreme, he can afford to do that. But my worry is that he's not bringing the billionaires into relationship with the poor. He's just pitting the poor against the billionaires. So I wonder, on the level of cognition, on the level of intelligence, if there's not some sort of civic duty, if there's not some sort of meta-narrative, this idea of the nation, this idea of humanity, that allows not only the low intelligence people to have guidance in their daily life, but gives, motivates or incentivizes the really intelligent people to give their extra intelligence in service to the rest of everybody else.
Yeah, I think that, there's a lot to unpack in that. Like, so that's, it's all, so one thing that struck me, and Bernie Sanders, the Democrats now, like one thing that they do is it seems to me the most important inequality in society is not economic, although that matters. It's cultural. It's how much cultural capital do you have? And when Bernie Sanders rails on billionaires and millionaires or whatever, it kind of rings hollow to me, because I think what matters more to the people that I talk to, like Midwestern folk, is that they feel that they're condescended to by a mainstream educated elite. And that's cultural inequality. There's sort of this, the sort of woke who judge you for everything and, scold you for saying the wrong epithet and you don't have the right beliefs about this or that. And if you like 2.5 Men, then you're a hopeless Philistine and we only watch The Wire and you know what I mean? And foreign independent films. That kind of inequality is much more visceral. You feel it right away when somebody has that attitude about you, right? Like, yeah, there are billionaires, but the fact of the matter is, like, I don't see billionaires. It doesn't mean much to me. It doesn't hurt me the way that it, remember that feeling that you had if you walked into like a party and you could just tell that you didn't belong there and nobody gave a shit that you were there. And you're just like, oh, like I hate these people. They hate me. Oh. That's the feeling that a lot of people have in today's society when the educated elites and the mainstream media talk to them. And I think that that's the greater inequality, and that's the cognitive inequality. It's this inequality of education. And I don't think, this gets back to the point I was talking about with like Republicans, I think might be in a better position to handle this, because I think that they're handling the cultural inequality better than Democrats are now. I think Democrats have become the party of the woke, the party of the hyper-educated, and that means they're inevitably actually going to promote that kind of inequality. And I agree with you. That's, I think, nationalism. Religion, I think, is another good source of this. I've had conversations, for example, Razib Khan and I were talking about the importance of religion, because it's the one thing, well, maybe not the only thing, but it's one of the unique institutions in our society still where you have a blend of cognitive abilities all together, right? So like, you were at Evergreen State, I was at Florida State in a grad program, and like, you're only around people whose IQs are 120 and above. Like I don't see people and I don't talk to people who are below 120. And in fact, it's amazing because, a lot of these academics, if your IQ is 120, they think you're stupid, right? I mean, they really do. And I'm like, do you have any idea? Like, like these professors would complain about students, I remember. And I'm like, dude, these students are like, they're probably a standard deviation smarter than the average person in the population, man. So religion, though, you go to your church, you don't care anymore about who's smart or who's not. You care about your beliefs, and you join in that, and you feel camaraderie because of that, and that bonds people across the cognitive divide. And you're right. I think we have to figure out, and nationalism's another way of doing this, figure out a way of making people feel that they have a duty to the greater good, like the way that military would too, right? And there's another thing is a problem is like progressives, and I don't want to go too far with this because I think Democrats have a largely favorable attitude toward the military, but there are definitely progressives who are kind of hostile to the military, to police departments, to fire departments, etc. These are the kinds of things where you blend cognitive abilities together, and if we lose that, we're going to be in trouble.
When you're talking about like religion, and I was thinking about religion can put somebody's beauty in service to the whole group rather than and I was just thinking of like a very beautiful singer. She goes up to the front of the church and she renders her gift to the whole congregation. It's no longer like she'd be criticized or for making it all about her. It's not about her, but the whole community gets to participate in her beauty, and she gets to be almost free of that weight of being, paid attention to all the time for being beautiful in a way.
Yeah, because and that's
the same thing can happen with intelligence, like with art, like what the Catholic Church has done with the amazing skill of the Renaissance artists and stuff.
Yeah, and in fact, like it's an interesting, it's sort of an interesting. Again, getting back to this dialectic between like individualism and sort of like the tribe or whatever, because it is true. Individualism's often good, right? But one of the side effects is that your gifts start to become more about you. You're the artist. I'm going to sign my name. I want what I deserve the credit for this. Whereas, say before that, the idea was my gifts are from God and I'm rendering them onto the church or onto the people, and it's not about me. I'm just some conduit or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And as the trick is like, where's the, because the Renaissance is awesome. Like, I don't want to scale back that or something. So you have to kind of find the balance between, your gift is I think of it like a basketball player. Like, if I'm on a team, I'm no good at basketball, by the way, so I don't know why I use this example, but it's just a clear one. Like, if I'm on a team and there's somebody who's better than I am on the team, I'm happy because that means I'm going to win more games. And so I don't feel jealous of that person. In fact, I bask in that person's glory.
Do you even serve them? Do you do everything you can to make them even better?
Absolutely, yeah. Defer to them, work hard to make them better. And then I feel like this sort of pride when they succeed. And that's the kind of feeling that's really awesome. And it's something that I would like to see us put more, if we can get that somehow. Like, that's why, like, the sort of Ronald Reagan, America's awesome, like, we're this great country. Like, it's easy to mock it sometimes, but that helps people, because if I'm working at a corner store or whatever, and I take care of my family, at least I can feel like I'm helping America. I'm a person here, I'm raising my family, I'm helping this country, and when the rich people in this country do well, I'm a part of that. And instead of being bitter and envious, I can feel good about that. If you take that away and you saying America's a great country is somehow chauvinistic, then what do I have to feel pride in? Or I'm just going to feel envy about those who have more than I do. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
It reminds me of, I think it's the Steinbeck quote that I've been thinking about lately. I think it's Steinbeck about Americans are temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? We're fine with the millionaires because any day I'll be a millionaire. But there's something else going on. It's that I don't need to be envious about the person who's making billions and billions of dollars more than me, because I have some sort of humility about the amount of value that they're adding to the society, as long as the person who's making the very successful people aren't basking in their own success for their own sake. So it has to be a dynamic where the people who excel are appreciative of those who are under them, and those who are under them. It has to be the whole community has to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the problem when you get like some, like the stereotypical like tech elite who's sort of snobbish and like, like hoi polloi, they don't understand this, and like they have these weird morals, and I was pro gay marriage in 1982 because I'm so progressive, and like, that's where you get that alienation, because now not only are you making $1.5 billion, something I can't even comprehend, but you're also condescending to me and judging me for hunting and for going to church, and for, I think of this with immigration as well. So like people who are in these more traditional communities that have been relatively stable demographically, they don't want them to change. And like, we can argue about whether that's good or bad, but I think it's perfectly natural, and it's probably something that we should be a little bit sympathetic to. And you can see how you do have, now I know people say this is a dog whistle, but there is really a cosmopolitan elite. Like, I don't think that's not disparaging. It's just a description. There's a group of people who travel everywhere, and they feel at home in Italy, in the United States, in their third house in France, or whatever it is, right? And so, they don't have the same kind of ties to their local community that other people have, and they have different values. And I think it's easy to see why you would get pissed off about that if you lived in rural Michigan, and why, when somebody came along, however Boris Trump is, who said, F those people, like, I love you, I'm here for you, I'm doing this for you, you can see why people flock to that, and they found it like, I think they thought he was kind of crude, but here's a guy who's fighting for me and who's sticking his finger in the eye of these elites who are condescending to me all the time. And he likes fast food and he likes these tacky TV programs, and so do I,
Yeah. The problem is convincing the conservatives to appreciate the liberals. I've been working on trying to get the liberals to.
Is that right?
I'm the next step of the game is to prove, because people, I think that they accept me as a liberal, but they're really harsh on my liberal guests, my audience, come down pretty hard and say that liberalism always leads to disaster. It's inherently wrong. I'm like, you need it. You love your iPhone. You love the video games that you play. You love all these innovations. You want it, but you want it within a certain realm of radioactivity. You don't want it cancerous. You want it, stimulating, So. Yeah,
no, that's interesting. Yeah. I find this is, I did this thread about leaving the left, I guess. Yeah. And I picked up 700, 800 followers from it. And then what I noticed is when I criticized Donald Trump's response to the coronavirus, I lost 100 followers in 10 minutes. I was like, holy shit, what happened?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to know why you thought that was so atrocious, because that's going to be a trigger. People, I know my commenters saying you criticized Donald Trump.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I mean, first of all, I have always maintained that Trump was a boorish person, and I think that's pretty clear. I mean, he's a person who mocked somebody with a disability. He's clearly ignorant of the world. But now I think he has some qualities that are good when you're in a culture war. He doesn't apologize. He's mercilessly tribal. He stuck up for Brett Kavanaugh when a lot of people would have caved, and I can understand why people like that. However, when you get to a crisis in which you have to unify people and in which you have to accept responsibility for your own failures, he is catastrophically ill-suited. Okay. And so, I mean, for one thing, if you look at I was saying dude, look, 4 weeks ago, it was clear that this was going to be a major catastrophe for the United States. And I was saying that not because I'm a genius, but because I was reading what the experts were saying. And Trump, up until a week ago, was essentially maintaining that this would just be some kind of blip and it was basically another flu. And I have a lot of conservative relatives who picked up that message and who were saying that. And I had some people who were pretty nasty to me on Twitter saying, basically, you're an idiot. This is nothing, whatever. And I think they were doing that because they were following the lead of conservative media and Donald Trump. And now it's clear that Trump recognizes the severity of the problem, and people around him have said, you can't do that anymore. This is going to get worse, and people are going to be more and more disconcerted by your response. But I think it's too late. I mean, he bungled the thing about as badly as you can bungle it. And when you watch his, I've tried to watch all of his press conferences about it. The thing that really stands out to me is that there is absolutely zero empathy coming. He's incapable of empathizing with people. So you watch even Justin Trudeau, whom I mostly dislike, actually severely dislike. At least he's you're worried. I understand that. Things are disconcerting for people right now. It's going to get worse. We have to be prepared for this, but X, Y, and Z. At least you get this sense of community and yes, I am afraid. I am worried. Trump just cannot do that because he does not have that personality characteristic. And I mean, can you imagine if Obama were president right now? He'd be knocking these speeches out of the park, just giving these very comforting. And I know, the sort of libertarians, I like Charles W. Cook a lot, for example. And I know he'd say, well, that's, the president's just one person, big deal, whatever. You shouldn't worship the president. Yes, but the president has a huge microphone. And what the president says really can make you feel better, or it can make you feel a lot worse. It can make you prepare, or it can make you be this is just a hoax. And so, I've just been disgusted by it. And I want to be clear, I don't want to vote for a Democrat. I really don't. I watched the debate, the Biden-Sanders debate, and I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to vote for Biden because Trump has so alienated me. Then I watched that debate and I was just like, no, no, please stop. Just this like Biden is basically like, we're not going to deport anybody unless they commit a felony, which is essentially open borders. I mean, you can say it's not, but if you're not going to deport anybody, so I'm between. If I to get highfalutin, I'm between Scylla and Charybdis, or a rock and a hard place, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I like the GOP better, but I find Trump so nauseatingly incompetent and boorish that he alienates me so much that I don't want to reward him. Do you not? You must just be pretty good about not saying your views.
I don't say my views. I allowed myself to criticize Sanders because he went through Seattle, and I went to the rally in Tacoma, and the speakers that came on before him were like, we're going to start a socialist revolution and take down capitalist oppression. The problem with our country isn't disparity, it's greed. And then all the well-fed people behind her like start smacking like, and we're going to take away the money from the billionaires. I'm like, this isn't how economy works.
Yeah, I know.
So I had to go after Sanders.
Yeah, I saw this. It's in the debate. Another thing was like the way that Sanders was treating pharmaceutical companies, just like utterly berating them. And I'm like, dude, like, look, we can criticize some of their practices, but pharmaceutical companies are going to save our country. I mean, we want profit is a good thing. It's not. Yeah. I think in Bernie Sanders' worldview, all profit is somehow robbery from somebody. You know what I mean? It's just like, if you're making profit, it's because you're stealing it from another human. And yeah, I mean, I don't like that.
You know what? That makes sense because, I mean, the problem that, I'm sorry, I try to suspend my criticism of him because I don't want to be disagree, but like, he's made so much money off of these poor people that are giving him $5, $27, no refunds for that. And even to this day, he still has these donation centers up, and the math is going to work out that he's losing. So where's all this money going? Right. And then he's constantly asking for money. So he's in a begging position, and then he's going to steal from the rich, but he's stealing from the poor in order to afford to steal from the rich. It's just, there's something that doesn't add up.
Well, I think Michael Bloomberg, about the only thing that he said that was good in any of the debates is basically like Bernie Sanders is the socialist who owns 3 homes or whatever, and it's like, yeah, it's true. And like profit is good. Yeah. Right. Profit is the sort of like fuel for the engine of innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's just a problem that some people don't understand how markets work, and they think inevitably that if you're making money, somehow you're a bad person, or like Walmart is bad, or the pharmaceuticals are bad, or the crook billionaires, or whatever.
And my argument is that it starts out as an economic disparity argument, right? It starts out as a platform where the billionaires have and the poor people don't, and then it eventually gets translated into those people are more beautiful or more well-spoken or more intelligent than me, and that wrongs me. Like the people that have anything more than me on any vector, that's how the narrative eventually works out across the spectrum of intelligence, because people can't calculate or disimpersonalize. That's an interesting thought of just like the kind of it promotes a kind of bitter envy that I think we should attempt to subdue, right? Right. Yeah. Although, to be charitable to a Sanders supporter, they might say, well, yeah, it does sometimes do that, but sometimes envy is good. Yeah. Sometimes you actually need it because sometimes people are taking too much, and so. If you were to argue about France before the French Revolution, like clearly there was a group of people who were absorbing a lot of the wealth of the country, and people should have been bitter about it. I mean, they probably shouldn't have had the revolution the way they did. Yeah. So just to be fair to them, I agree with you. I don't like the kind of, and I find the people who support
I almost find the people who are on the platform with Sanders who give those talks more unsavory than Sanders.
Yeah.
Because I'm more alarmed by wokeism than I am by the class stuff. So like Linda Sarsour bothers me more, right? That kind of like racial resentment shit where you know, because you can't do anything about that. Like economic stuff, sometimes there's actually like a non-zero sum solution. You know, we can, you know, everybody wins a little bit. When you start breaking into these groups of races and competing for stuff, then it's all non-zero sum.
It doesn't. It doesn't add up to anything but just shouting and tearing each other apart. That's all it leads to.
It sounds as though we're ending on such a positive note.
Yeah, aren't we? Aren't we uplifting? Was there something glorious for you to tap off into the sunset?
Yeah, let me see. Is there anything optimistic I can say?
Okay,
you know what? I will say this. I find hope in the amount of humorous memes that people have been sharing that are absolutely delightful to other people. And I think about, can you imagine whatever we may think of Twitter now, can you imagine quarantining without this Skype, the ability to talk? Yeah. Did you see the one with the guy who was eating the cars with the sock?
Yeah, I saw that one.
That thing was fucking genius, man. Yeah. People need to keep making those. So that's what gives me hope. And that's
ultimately that's what I was thinking, trying to imagine a world without a religion that doesn't fall into a worse religion. I was thinking, you know, the memes might just unite us.
The memes might save us. Cat memes.
Yeah.
There are some pretty glorious ones. Agreed. All right. Well, I'm about ready to take off.
All right. Thanks so much,
appreciate
man.
it a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Yep. You too. Thanks. Yep.
All right. Bye. Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.